In the heart of a forbidden village, under a blood-red moon, Naima moves through the shadows, her breath uneven. Flickering torchlight reveals tribal markings on her arms, symbols of an inherited oath. A distant drumbeat echoes, steady and ancient. She clutches the talisman around her neck, recalling elders' warnings, but it's too late to turn back. From the darkness, unblinking, glowing eyes emerge. A whisper slithers through the trees, calling her name in a forgotten tongue. As she steps forward, the ground beneath her shifts, and her world changes forever. What happens next will leave you breathless. Watch till the end.
Before we continue this thrilling tale, take a moment to support our journey. If you're enjoying the story, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. And we'd love to hear from you. Comment below and tell us, where are you watching from? Let's see how far our legends have traveled across the world. The heat lay heavy over the village of Malu, thick like the breath of a restless spirit. The air smelled of roasted plantains, of sweat, of something deeper that clung to the earth. The scent of stories buried under layers of time, waiting to be unearthed. The sky had begun to darken, not from the passage of the sun, but from the brewing storm that had threatened all day, its weight pressing down on the thatched rooftops and the ancient baobab trees that whispered secrets to those who cared to listen. Kwame walked slowly, his sandals kicking up the red dust beneath him. He had always known this place, had memorized its rhythms the way one memorizes the lullabies of childhood. And yet, today, it felt unfamiliar, as though the land had shifted just enough to unsettle his senses. A foreboding he could not name curled around his ribs. The summons had come at dawn. His father, Elder Barco, the man whose voice could summon a crowd and whose silence could make the bravest men wither, had sent for him. The messenger, a boy no older than 12, had avoided his gaze, delivering the words in hushed urgency before scurrying away as if afraid to linger in his presence. Kwame knew what the summons meant. It was time. The burden of his bloodline was heavy. He had spent his youth resisting it, dreaming of leaving, of carving his own path in a world beyond the confines of Malu. But fate had other plans. His father, the guardian of their people's sacred traditions, had held on to him like a chain woven in flesh and duty. And now, the time had come for him to inherit that chain. As he neared the compound, his stomach coiled in dread. The gathering of elders outside the hut spoke volumes. Men whose faces bore the weight of centuries, whose eyes had witnessed things whispered about only in the dead of night. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the lingering scent of medicinal herbs. His father sat on the carved wooden stool, the weight of authority draped over him like an ancestral robe. His body had grown frail with age, but his presence was undiminished. His gaze met Kwame's, pinning him in place. "You have come," Elder Barco said, his voice low, heavy with expectation. Kwame bowed his head in respect, though his fists clenched at his sides. "I had no choice, Father." The elder let out a sound that was neither approval nor disappointment, something unreadable. "There is a matter that must be settled, a duty that has awaited you since the day you were born." Kwame's jaw tightened. He had spent years preparing for this moment, yet now that it was here, he felt unready, as if he stood at the edge of something vast and dark, unable to see what lay beyond. A shadow moved in the corner of the hut, and Kwame's breath caught. She was here. Naima. She stepped forward, the flickering light of the oil lamp casting strange shapes across her face. She had always been beautiful in a way that unsettled him, as though she belonged to a realm just beyond reach. Her presence was a quiet storm, her eyes deep pools that reflected things one was not meant to see. "You have seen the dreams, haven't you?" she asked softly. Kwame stiffened. Yes, the dreams had begun a month ago. Dark, tangled visions that wrapped around his sleep like vines. He had dismissed them at first, blaming fatigue, but they had persisted, growing more vivid with each passing night. The whisper of voices, the feeling of unseen hands brushing against his skin. The pull towards something he could not name. His father watched him, waiting. Kwame swallowed. Yes. A murmur passed through the gathered elders. Naima stepped closer. Then you know what must be done. He did. The curse was awakening. The weight of generations pressed against his chest. Malu had long been bound by an ancient pact, one that had kept the village prosperous, but demanded a price in return. A sacred duty that had passed from father to son, binding the firstborn of each generation to the ritual. Kwame had spent his life running from it, but one cannot outrun the will of the ancestors. His father rose with slow, deliberate movements, his gaze unreadable. Tomorrow, at the hour of the first moon, the ritual must be completed. The ancestors have spoken. Kwame felt the air shift around him, as if the spirits themselves had drawn closer. He looked to Naima, searching for something, reassurance, understanding. But her expression remained unreadable. There was no escape. Tomorrow, he would stand before the altar of the forgotten gods. Tomorrow, he would decide whether to embrace his fate or shatter it. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain pounding against the earth like a warning. The rain continued long into the night, falling in thick sheets against the thatched roofs, drumming against the wooden walls of the compound. Kwame lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his hut, his mind a tangled web of thoughts. The ritual, the very thing he had spent his life avoiding, was now inevitable. The ancestors had spoken, and in Malu, their voices carried more weight than the living. The elders claimed that the ritual maintained balance, that it kept the darkness at bay. But what if it was the ritual itself that fed the darkness? What if the true curse was obedience? A whisper of wind brushed through his hut, though the shutters were closed. The candle beside his bed flickered, its flame bending unnaturally. A chill crawled up his spine. The spirits were watching. Kwame squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to sleep. But sleep did not come. Instead, the dreams did. He stood in a clearing, the great baobab tree towering over him, its ancient roots twisting like the fingers of something buried but not dead. The air was thick with the scent of blood and burning herbs. A figure stood before him, its face shrouded in shadows, its voice a low murmur that slithered into his ears. "It is your turn, child of Barco. Will you give or will you take?" Kwame tried to step back, but his feet were rooted to the earth. The shadows stretched toward him, cold fingers brushing against his skin. A distant scream echoed through the darkness, Naima's voice. Then he woke, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. The hour of the first moon was near. He rose mechanically, dressing in the ceremonial robes laid out for him, deep crimson, embroidered with symbols of protection and sacrifice. He had worn these once before, during his initiation into the ways of the ancestors. That night, too, had been filled with whispers. Outside, the village was eerily silent. The storm had passed, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and something more, something metallic, blood. Kwame's stomach clenched as he stepped into the ritual grounds. The altar stood at the heart of the sacred grove, a massive stone slab, weathered by centuries. The elders were already gathered, their faces masked in ceremonial paint, their hands gripping staffs of power. His father stood at the front, his gaze unreadable. Naima was there too, draped in white, her wrists bound with red cloth. Kwame's breath caught. No, he had not been told. Naima was the sacrifice. His pulse thundered in his ears. The ritual had always demanded a life, an offering to appease the spirits, but never had he imagined it would be her. Naima met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw neither fear nor defiance, only knowing. "It is your turn, child of Barco. Will you give or will you take?" The voice from his dream echoed in his mind. His father stepped forward, extending a dagger. The hilt was ancient, carved from the bone of their ancestors, its blade honed to a wicked edge. Kwame did not move. The weight of generations bore down upon him, the expectation of obedience, the chains of duty. Naima closed her eyes. The drumbeat began, slow, steady. The moment stretched, an eternity trapped in a single breath. Kwame reached for the dagger. His fingers closed around the hilt, the drums quickened. The air grew thick with power, the shadows curling around the altar, waiting, hungry. Naima's lips parted, a single word whispered into the night. Choose. And Kwame, son of Barko, heir to the ancestors, bearer of the curse, raised the blade. Kwame's grip tightened around the dagger. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like the ancient baobab tree's roots wrapping around a buried corpse. The drum beats throbbed in his chest, merging with the erratic pounding of his heart. Naima's gaze remained steady, unafraid, knowing. Around them, the elders chanted, their voices weaving into the wind, calling upon the spirits. The shadows in the grove thickened, writhing as if something unseen had awakened. Kwame's father stepped forward. His face was as unreadable as ever, but there was something in his eyes, something more than expectation. Do not fail your bloodline, Kwame. His hands trembled. The ritual demanded sacrifice. The ancestors would not be denied. His father had once stood where he was now, as had his grandfather, and every firstborn before them. The blood of a loved one, a life for a life. Kwame swallowed, his throat dry as dust. He had known of the ritual since childhood, but it had always felt distant, a legend whispered by the fire, a duty that belonged to the past. Until now. Will you give or will you take? The voice from his dream slithered into his mind. Naima closed her eyes, her lips parting in silent surrender. A gust of wind howled through the grove, sending the torches flickering. The shadows stirred, growing restless. The ancestors were waiting. His grip on the dagger tightened. His father raised a hand. The final signal. Kwame lifted the blade. The chant rose to a fevered pitch, the air thick with power. Naima exhaled softly. And then, he turned the dagger. The movement was swift, almost instinctual. His arm twisted, the blade reversing in his grip. Before the elders could react, before the ancestors could claim their due, Kwame plunged the dagger deep into his own chest. A collective gasp echoed through the grove. The drum beats stopped. The shadows recoiled. Pain bloomed in his body, white-hot and searing, but beneath it was something else, something freeing. The blood of a loved one. The ritual did not specify whose. Naima's eyes widened. His father lunged toward him, but it was too late. The ancestors had been fed. A wail split the night, a sound not of this world. The air shuddered. The darkness thickened, twisting, writhing, hungry. The ground beneath the altar cracked. A wind unlike any other howled through the trees, carrying voices long dead, their words sharp as broken bones. Kwame's body sagged, his vision darkening at the edges. But through the haze of pain he saw it. The spirits. For centuries, they had been bound to the ritual, shackled by the blood sacrifices made in their name. They had not been appeased. They had been enslaved, until now. The spirits howled, surging from the cracks in the earth, spilling into the grove like a storm given form. Their rage was palpable, their hunger insatiable. The elders screamed. One by one, they fell, some clutching their throats, others writhing as unseen hands tore at them. Kwame's father staggered back, his face contorted in horror. The balance had not been maintained. It had been shattered. Naima rushed forward, catching Kwame as he collapsed. His vision blurred, but he could still see her face, streaked with tears. "Stay with me, Kwame." Her voice trembled. The spirits surged past them, their wrath reserved for those who had bound them. Kwame's fingers twitched, reaching for Naima's hand. A choice had been made. A curse had been broken, but at what cost? Darkness swallowed him whole. A deep, suffocating blackness wrapped around Kwame, pressing into his lungs, his thoughts, his very essence. It was not the quiet embrace of sleep, but something far worse. A realm between life and death. A place where the spirits of the forgotten roamed without form, their whispers crawling against his skin like unseen hands. The voices of the ancestors raged around him, raw and untethered. "You have broken the cycle. You have stolen what is owed." The blood was not given, it was taken. Kwame could not speak. His body was weightless, his soul floating in the void. The pain from the dagger's wound had faded, but something deeper ached within him. A tear in the fabric of something ancient. A wound, not of flesh, but of fate. Then, through the cacophony of wailing spirits, a sound emerged. Soft, familiar. A heartbeat. It was steady, strong. Not his own. Naima. A force yanked him forward, and suddenly he was falling, crashing back into his body with a gasp. His lungs burned as he sucked in air. The world around him was chaos. The grove was no longer a sacred ground, it was a battlefield of unseen forces. Naima's arms were around him, holding him against her chest. Her breath was ragged, her hands shaking. "You're alive," she whispered. "You're still here." But Kwame could barely focus on her. The grove had become a storm of shadow and screams. The spirits had been unleashed, and they were taking their vengeance. The elders, once so powerful in their authority, were nothing now. Their bodies twisted, their mouths frozen in silent agony as the spirits reclaimed what had been denied for generations. His father was on his knees, clutching his own throat, his face contorted in shock. Kwame had expected fury in his father's eyes, but all he saw was fear. Pure, undiluted terror. Not at Kwame, at something behind him. A hand gripped his wrist. Cold. Ancient, not human. Kwame turned slowly. The thing standing before him had no face, only a mask of shifting darkness. A towering figure, draped in shadows, its form flickering like firelight. The air around it twisted and cracked, as if the world itself was rejecting its presence. "You have undone the chain." The voice did not come from its mouth, it came from everywhere. "You are bound to us now." Kwame's breath caught in his throat. The spirits weren't leaving. They weren't done. They had been freed from the ritual, but they were not satisfied with just the elders. They had tasted freedom, and now they wanted more. Naima tightened her grip on him. "Kwame, we have to leave." But the spirits would not let them. A force slammed into them, knocking them apart. Kwame hit the ground hard, his vision spinning. He tried to push himself up, but his body was no longer his own. It was caught between realms, between the living and the dead. The spirit's hand reached for him again. "You gave your blood, but it was not enough." It was never enough. Something inside him snapped. A deep, primal instinct surged to the surface. The pain in his chest flared, the wound burning not with death, but with something else. Power. The ancestors had ruled through blood sacrifice, but what if there was another way? What if the cycle could be broken not by death, but by something greater? The spirits had been wrong, but so had he, and he was not going to be their pawn. Kwame forced himself to stand. His knees trembled, but his voice was steady. "I gave my own blood," he rasped. "Not out of fear, not out of duty, but out of choice." The spirits recoiled slightly, their forms flickering. "You do not control me," Kwame continued, stepping forward. "I'm not yours." The masked spirit tilted its head. "Then prove it." A deafening silence fell over the grove, and then the spirits attacked. They surged at him all at once, their wails shaking the trees, their forms stretching and twisting as they sought to consume him. The ground beneath him cracked, the very air trembling with their fury. Kwame closed his eyes, and then he let go. Not of himself, not of life, but of fear. A roar built in his chest, a sound that was not just his own, but a voice passed through generations, a voice of defiance, a voice of a son refusing to follow the sins of his forefathers. The ground pulsed, the spirits froze, and then they shattered. A blinding burst of light erupted from Kwame's body, surging outward like a tidal wave. The spirits screamed as they were pulled back into the void, back into the realm they had been bound to for centuries. And then, silence. The grove was still. The night air was cold. The elders lay lifeless. His father, the great leader, the man who had commanded with iron and tradition, was slumped on the ground, his body shivering like a child. Kwame staggered. Naima caught him before he fell. "It's over," she whispered. But Kwame wasn't so sure. Because as the wind carried away the last echoes of the spirits, a single whisper remained, curling around his ear like a serpent. You have broken one chain, but there will always be another. The curse was not gone, it had only changed, and Kwame knew his fight was far from over. End of section 4. This section delivers the brutal consequences of Kwame's defiance. The spirits are not just vengeful, they are relentless. The cycle of sacrifice has been broken, but something darker lurks beneath. The sky over the grove was thick with smoke, the scent of burned incense and blood lingering in the air like an unspoken curse. The bodies of the elders lay motionless in the sacred ground, where generations had knelt before them in servitude. The spirits had been cast out, their wrath subdued, but Kwame knew better than to believe in easy endings. Naima's grip on his arm was firm, as if she was the only thing tethering him to this world. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling from exhaustion, from power, from something deeper, something clawing at the edges of his soul. He turned toward his father. The once mighty man, feared and revered in equal measure, now knelt in the dirt like a broken idol, his hands pressed to the ground. He did not look at Kwame. He did not speak. Kwame took a step forward, his voice hoarse. "Is this what you wanted?" His father flinched, his fingers digging into the soil. "You don't understand," he rasped. "You've undone everything." "No," Kwame said. "I freed us." His father's snap, eyes dark with fury and something else, something deeper. "You are a fool if you think this is freedom." His voice was no longer the voice of a leader, but of a man unraveling. "You think breaking one chain makes you free? The spirits were never the only ones holding us." Kwame's stomach turned. He had expected resistance. He had expected anger. But what he saw in his father's face wasn't just rage, it was fear. And that terrified him more than anything. Naima stepped closer. "Kwame, we need to leave." The wind shifted. A low hum filled the air like a distant drumbeat echoing from deep within the earth. Kwame turned his head, his pulse quickening. The trees whispered. The ground trembled. Something was coming. Something worse. The spirits were gone, but something else had taken their place. His father let out a hollow, broken laugh. "Did you really think they were the source? Did you think they were the only ones keeping balance?" Kwame's skin prickled. The elders had performed the sacrifices. The spirits had demanded blood. But who had first struck the bargain? Who had first bound the tribe to this cycle of death and obedience? Not the spirits. Something older. Something deeper. The ground split open. A scream, ancient, guttural, ripped through the air. Naima pulled Kwame back as a force unlike anything he had felt before surged upward from the earth. It was not the spirits. It was something more primal. Something woven into the very bones of the land. The trees twisted. The air burned. And from the depths of the broken earth, something rose. It had no form, no face, only a writhing mass of shadows, shifting and coiling like smoke caught in a storm. And it was hungry. His father collapsed, whispering feverish words under his breath. "It cannot be stopped. The spirits were only a shield. They took the sacrifice to keep it asleep. Without them," his voice broke, "you have woken something far worse." The entity turned its attention toward Kwame. It did not speak. It did not need to. It reached for him. A scream tore from his throat as pain, pure, blistering pain, flooded through his body. It was inside him, ripping through his veins, pulling at the very essence of who he was. It was consuming him. The power he had taken, the power he had wielded to banish the spirits, was nothing compared to this. Naima was shouting his name. He could barely hear her. He fell to his knees, the world tilting around him. It was inside him. It was claiming him. No. He had broken the cycle. He had chosen his own fate. He would not be consumed. With the last ounce of strength he had left, he forced his hand forward, pressing his palm against the earth. The shadows shrieked, recoiling at the contact. Kwame gritted his teeth, pushing harder. "I am not yours." The shadows trembled. "You do not own me." A surge of energy shot through his body, not from the spirits, not from the ancestors, but from him. His will, his defiance, his refusal to be a pawn in an ancient game. The shadows screamed, the ground shaking as they writhed. And then, silence. The entity collapsed inward, vanishing into the depths from which it had come. The trees stilled, the wind calmed, the air was empty. Kwame gasped, his body collapsing against the earth. His vision swam, his limbs ached. Naima's hands were on his shoulders, her voice breaking. "You're still here." Kwame looked up at her. He was alive, but everything had changed. His father had not moved, the elders were gone, the spirits were gone. The cycle was broken, but at what cost? The village would not understand. They would not see him as a savior. To them, he had defied the ancestors, had broken the order that had governed them for generations. He had no place here anymore. Naima must have seen it in his eyes because she nodded, her grip tightening. "Then we leave." The stars above them were vast and endless. Kwame took one last look at the grove, the place where he had been bound, where he had been broken, where he had been reborn. Then he turned away. He did not look back. Because the past had already claimed too much of him, and he would not let it take anything more. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more thrilling African folklore and mysteries, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Tell us which country you're watching from in the comments. We love hearing from our global family. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales, and remember, every story holds a lesson waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe now and join the journey. See you in the next story.